Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was at the United Nations this week, recognising a Palestinian state, speaking about the climate crisis and calling for unity in times of global conflict.
To build a world governed by rights and rules, not fear or force.
But the headlines this week were dominated by the words of a different man, and they told a different story.
We are the hottest country anywhere in the world, and there is no other country even close.
At times, the lies and mistruths came so fast it was hard for journalists to keep up. Today, I'm talking to editor Lenore Taylor and national news editor Jo Tovey about the globalisation of misinformation and why facts still matter. Good morning, Lenore.
Morning, Bridie.
Good morning, Jo.
Morning, Bridie.
The news this week has once again been dominated by the words and actions of one man. What have we learned this week about the impact of Trump's misinformation?
Well, the fact that President Trump spouts misinformation and untruths isn't new. I mean, I think the Washington Post counted something like, 30,000 and something untruths in his first term. So that's not new. I think what is increasingly apparent is that what he spouts in America doesn't just affect America. When he has the global stage and the authority of the presidency of the United States, and he spouts falsehoods like he did this week, for example, around the impact of taking paracetamol when you're pregnant, it filters through to the rest of the world quite quickly. I think the tactic of using simplistic falsehoods to fuel the politics of grievance and blame is filtering through around the world. Everyone is, other nativist parties are looking at that and thinking, that's working, we want a bit of what he's having. So I think the impact of his tactics, which we've seen for a long time globally, is becoming more and more evident. And also what really struck me this week is just the asymmetry of it. Here he is at the United Nations General Assembly saying climate change is a hoax and, mass migration is sending you all to hell. And nobody's jeering or interjecting. Everyone's sitting there and playing by the rules and nodding sagely and just copying it. And that's because he's the president of the United States, because he has been democratically elected and he has the authority of that office to pursue the tactics that he's been pursuing all along, just makes it all the more effective and all the more globally impactful. I think that's what we saw this week.
We've been covering him for years, as you mentioned, and dealing with his misinformation for years. So what did the decisions in the newsroom look like this week?
So Newsroom's had some really quick decisions to make this week when Trump stood up to make his announcement linking autism falsely to the use of paracetamol in pregnancy. This is not a new problem. I mean, newsrooms have always had to deal with how do you deal with mistruths on the fly, but with Trump, where this is a regular problem and whose everything he says goes global, it's something that we often have to grapple with in real time, and it's something you have to think about. How do you headline a live blog? How do you, if you're a broadcaster, what do you screen? What do you not screen? How do you sort of fact check claims in real time? And there's such a risk with, health misinformation like this when you're speaking to a particularly vulnerable population, pregnant women who are at very heightened levels often of anxiety about what they're ingesting. Autism itself is such a sensitive issue. It was a sort of invidious position really to be dealing with this as a live news event.
There isn't two sides to misinformation, but you do have to kind of fact check, as Jo says, in the moment, because if you let it stand, people have read it without the factual information around it. So it's like you have to live fact check as you live blog or in a news story say, the president said this, but the evidence is this. You've sort of got to embed fact checking in your reporting, not as a separate thing, in order to do your readers the service of making sure that information's always in the context of truth.
You referenced headlining the live blog, Jo. And I think that is one of the more noticeable changes over the past few years in the coverage of Trump. How have we changed how we headline articles and live blogs compared to, say, what we did 8 years ago?
There used to be a broader assumption in journalism that sunlight was the best disinfectant, that if you broadcast the crazy things that powerful people say, your audiences will inherently understand that this is crazy and it's not really our job to make the call one way or another. I think the sort of ideas about objectivity have shifted over time, But we now know that that is not necessarily the case, that if we put up headlines with mistruths in it, that those mistruths stick, and that we have a greater responsibility really to filter information, that is our job. We're not just there to be stenographers for information. We're there to present and collate truths for our audience. So I think it's something that the media industry, maybe too slowly at times, has really adjusted its behaviour between the first and the second Trump administration particularly.
And we have to always bear in mind that people might only see the headline or the headline in the first three parts in an off-platform environment, or because they're skimming or whatever. So if you've got the rebuttal or the truthful information right at the bottom of the story, people might not even see that. The other thing that I find quite disconcerting, though, is that as people like President Trump want to deliberately devalue or delegitimise what we do, there has been a whole kind of push to delegitimise fact-checking as part of the push to call us fake news and delegitimise news itself. And so that happened in the United States, where, there was the regulators were attacking the platforms that were fact-checking off-platform commentary and saying that it was a form of censorship. It happened here as well, that fact-checking organisations were really attacked for doing their job. So it's like the fight to keep the truth as the kernel of news, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, and allowing for a diversity of opinions, is getting harder and harder because of the, attempts right from the President of the United States to delegitimise what we do. And, I've said it before, but I'll bang the gong again. We should never use the term fake news in any kind of normalised way, because it is made up, that term is made up to undermine what we do. If it's fake, it's not news. You can get news wrong and correct it. It can be badly written news, but if it's fake, it's not news. And I don't think we should fall into the trap of doing his work for him. I mean, we should also say that it's much more difficult for our colleagues in the United States, where the Trump administration is also apparently really trying to influence the media or cow the media by taking very large and difficult defamation action, sometimes with apparent very little cause, against big media organisations, who might need regulatory approval for something and therefore don't want to upset the Trump administration, like staying the course of truthful journalism when the Trump administration has actual and real power over you and your business and is prepared to exercise that power, is a difficult thing. And I think it would be a very difficult environment. And I think a lot of media organisations there are doing a really good job in continuing to do great journalism in spite of all of that.
Yeah, but we're also seeing real moments of weakness, like the Jimmy Kimmel episode this week. He's not a journalist and he's not doing journalism, but you did see the bosses at Disney, buckle under pressure from Trump, from his FCC chairman, in ways that were incredibly disturbing and, we hope won't send a chill through speech more generally in America, but it's hard to see how it won't. I guess I just wanted to say too,
and then he did come back, though.
He did come back, but it was an incredibly disturbing episode nonetheless. And I guess it's worth noting that, as well as the sort of misinformation that's coming out of the White House at the moment, the media is vulnerable because it is so corporatized and concentrated in America that, that a lot of those companies, they rely on federal government for mergers and acquisitions, and we're seeing the effects of that play out in real time. I would say that as well, the fact that, media companies have been under pressure from the sort of digital revolution over the last 20 years, that you've seen a lot of newsrooms eroded of experience and, just pure numbers of journalists, makes it more difficult than ever to hold powerful people to account, and I think that's why it's really important that people look to trusted sources of information and that we in the media continue to take our job really seriously.
And we're really fortunate. We've got a quite large operation in the US now from The Guardian. We use their copy on Guardian Australia, and I think they're doing a great job.
After his remarks on paracetamol, Mark Butler almost instantly asked the TGA if there was a need to review their advice. What are the pros and cons of that approach?
I mean, I think in terms of, from Mark putting yourself in the government's position, you can absolutely see why he did that, and the TGA came out very strongly and swiftly to reaffirm that paracetamol was considered safe in pregnancy when following the normal guidelines. So absolutely politically, you can understand that. From a news perspective, it was an interesting moment because there was this gap between him telling a press conference, we're seeking advice on paracetamol, and that response coming through. And in covering him saying we were seeking that advice, you could see how that could be interpreted as we think
maybe Trump's right.
Maybe Trump's right. Maybe we've lost confidence in paracetamol. Maybe there are new questions, new evidence around paracetamol that have raised our concerns in Australia as well, which wasn't the case. So finding a way, again, to cover his remarks in a way that didn't cause further alarm was another challenge that we faced. And this is a real challenge, again, for a fast-moving 24-hour news cycle. Like, we're not a magazine. We can't sit back and wait days to sort of pull everything together. When you're covering it in real time, you have to think about how things can be interpreted, particularly, as Lenore said, like, a lot of people only read headlines or only read the top lines of stories. Most people in Australia are not super engaged in the news. They might hear grabs on the radio. They scan a website every now and again. So you've got to think so carefully about, is this headline spreading mistruths? Is it spreading accurate information? Am I causing unnecessary alarm? And it's a lot.
And, let's face it, the point of the exercise was to sow doubt. And, my concern is that even a woman who can read science, can understand that paracetamol isn't dangerous during pregnancy, taken in the, according to instructions, if there's like a niggle in the back of your mind and you're in that vulnerable state and you want to do the right thing for your unborn child, I think it effectively sows doubt, exactly like anti-vax information effectively sows doubt. And if it's coming from the President of the United States and, there are studies cited claiming an association and you don't really understand the difference between a correlation and an association, I think it probably will have an impact.
I also couldn't help but think of families and, people within the autism community hearing this information this week who might have been thinking, did I cause this? Was this my fault? Was I not careful enough? Did I prioritize my own well-being, taking something for a headache or a fever?
Feeling guilty.
And Trump saying tough it out was incredibly shaming, I think, of women, and suggesting that women who, try to look after their own health and follow those guidelines, who may have, taken paracetamol, as, I did, as so many people need to do during pregnancy, that they were somehow like putting their own kind of short-term needs over the longer-term health of their child.
Because they weren't tough enough.
Because they weren't tough enough. I mean, it was awful.
I know it's really difficult to speculate, but why do you think Trump wanted to sow doubts in pregnant women taking paracetamol? What is the goal here?
Far be it from me to try to put myself in President Trump's mind. However, if you're looking for a pattern, it's blame. It's finding Big Pharma or them, the other, to blame for something in your life. That's a kind of thread through most of the things that he says and does. So best guess, maybe that. Maybe he just wanted to sort of be there with RFK Jr. I don't know. The answer is I don't know, but blame is my best guess.
Yeah, I mean, and RFK Jr. is someone who's long held conspiracy theories around vaccines, and vaccines were the other part of this press conference. Once again, you had Trump telling people to defy medical advice around what vaccines to take when in infancy. He was making wild and false claims about putting too much liquid into babies, really crazy stuff.
And talking about how it was all based on his feeling.
Yeah.
That was a very obvious example of Trump affecting Australian politics, that Mark Butler had to go to the TGA and ask that question. But how else do you see Trump affecting Australian politics?
Oh, in so many ways. I mean, let's take climate change or global heating. Again, at the UN General Assembly, he said it was a huge hoax. Everyone was being conned. That flows through to Australia as well. And I guess it emboldens columnists like those in News Corp who called the climate risk report that came out lately, they said it was disaster porn, that it was all overblown, like it's all a con idea is being propagated around the world. And if the President of the United States is saying it, that does kind of turbocharge that. And I guess there are people all around the world who are looking at the tactics that President Trump is using, finding very simplistic slogans that sort of supercharge the politics of grievance and division And they see that it's working for President Trump and in many other countries in the world. I mean, you can look at the surge in support for reform in the UK, for instance. And I think we can see that in Australia with the right wing of the coalition and the comments that Andrew Hastie has made, the comments that Tony Abbott is making from the sidelines, the commentary of Peter Credlin in The Australian, all really arguing those same kinds of things for Australia. Now, I don't know that they're going to work here. As we've said many times before, compulsory voting and preferential voting does sort of insulate us a bit, but they're taking sucker from President Trump's success and trying to emulate what he's doing. I think it's pretty obvious that that's sort of what Andrew Hastie and the right of the Liberal Party are doing to undermine Susan Lee and to try and see if they can be that kind of a populist nativist political force in Australia.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting this week, Andrew Hastie's video plea that we're making too many flat whites and not enough cars or something in that vein.
Ford Falcons, not enough Ford Falcons.
Which is very Trumpy. Like, Trump loves nothing more than standing in front of a big brum brum truck, car, whatever, and it's very macho and, the influence there is clear. But like Lenore, I think it's also worth remembering that these people within the Liberal Party at the moment are, they're facing electoral oblivion. This isn't a strategy that is paying off for them. It's not to say that it doesn't exist and this kind of globalisation of this style of politics isn't happening, but I do think it's worth sort of keeping in mind that it's proven to be highly ineffective in Australia, at least lately.
Yeah, absolutely. But the arguments are still filtering through. On global heating, there's this drop in the bucket argument. Doesn't matter what we do, nothing's going to, we can't change the world's temperature. Graham Redfern, our environment reporter, skewered that very neatly this week when he looked at the emissions from all the countries that were emitting as much as Australia as a proportion of global emissions and lower. And it adds up to more than what the US emits and almost what China emits. So if all those countries did nothing, the biggest emitters would do nothing, and then nothing would happen. That drop in the bucket argument, I think, is also being fueled sort of globally. You see that being argued in many, many countries. So the narrative, it's the globalisation of misinformation.
I think we can feel that globalisation of misinformation every morning when we get up and read and listen to the news. It can feel like we're being bombarded with mistruths and lies. Why do you still believe in the power of facts?
I have to in order to get up every morning and come to work. But I also don't think that's a crazy thing to believe in. If you look at how Australians voted at the last election, they weren't persuaded by climate denialism. They weren't persuaded by those sorts of arguments. If they voted for not just the Labor Party, but also Greens and Teals and other people with a variety of political views, but whose arguments were broadly based on truthfulness. And I think if we do our job well and if we do our best to get facts out there and if our political debate remains broadly grounded in facts, there's a reason for hope.
Yeah, I mean, I could see how a lot of journalists and people who consume news would be feeling quite despondent at the moment, thinking sort of what's the point of fact-checking in the face of so much misinformation. But I guess this was something that Glenn Kessler, who was a former fact-checker at the Washington Post, said, and I really agree with it. Like, you shouldn't really think about your job as a journalist as being changing the mind of politicians. Like, if Donald Trump ignores the fact-checking of the media, well, that's Donald Trump's prerogative. Politicians have always ignored the media to different degrees and carried on with doing whatever it is they want to do. It's our job to best inform the public. Like, it is our job to bring facts to the table so that people can make decisions about their own lives, about how they vote, about how they live, with all the facts at hand to counter sometimes the misinformation that comes from politics. And we can't really be deterred just because politicians somehow seem increasingly immune to shame. We just need to keep doing our job to focus on the core mission, I think, in this moment.
The alternative would be giving up, and that's just not an option.
And now it's time for what we can't get out of our heads this week. Lenore, what was that for you?
Okay, I kind of want to apologise to listeners because I usually go for something lighter to sort of, make things a bit fun at the end of the episode, but honestly, this week, I can't get Escalatorgate out of my head. It was when President Trump gave that speech to the UN General Assembly, there were not one but 2 or maybe 3 malfunctions. An escalator stopped when he and the First Lady were going in. The teleprompter didn't work, and there were some suggestions that the sound levels were a little low. And on Tuesday night on Fox News, his press secretary, Caroline Levitt, pointed to concerning reporting over the weekend from the London Times that UN globalist staffers were basically plotting to set up the President of the United States. I mean, to start with, imagine the UN being globalist, like that was a bad thing. Anywho, she said, at first it was the escalator, then it was the teleprompter. It doesn't look like a coincidence to me. And I know that we have people, including the United States Secret Service, who are looking into this to try to get to the bottom of it. Then it seemed to die down, and it seemed like the escalator was actually stopped by President Trump's own videographer who was trying to get shots of him. Not entirely clear on the facts, but it seemed to be dying down. But then the president took to Truth Social to say that there had been a triple sabotage at the UN. They ought to be ashamed of themselves, and that he was sending a copy to the UN Secretary General to demand an immediate investigation. So apparently the real news wasn't Gaza, not Ukraine, it was the escalator.
I actually have almost no response to that. It's the 17th thing this week that left me speechless. Joe, what could you not get out of your head this week?
So moving very far away from Trump and all things related to Trump.
And escalators.
To Victoria was the story I couldn't get out of my head. So as part of our Bird of the Year special, we've been running a lot of really beautiful features and comment pieces about different birds around Australia, different people's experiences with birds. And one that really stood out to me this week was a beautiful feature by Stephanie Convery about the Western Treatment Plant, which is Melbourne's largest sewage farm. And it is a place of abundant bird life. It apparently famously rivals Kakadu. I'd never heard of this place before, but she went out there last week and she saw brolgas, orange-bellied parrots, the critically endangered species, have been spotted at this place before. It was just such a beautiful story. It's so important, I think, to take people out of the political news agenda at the moment and to remind them that the rest of the world exists. And I thought this was sort of also the perfect metaphor, that if in this place, which is a literal sewage plant among literal shit, beauty is abundant, we can hopefully all take that hopefulness into our lives and maybe feel a little bit less despondent about what's going on.
And there's lots more bird content coming up with Bird of the Year, and everyone should soon be able to vote early and vote often.
Hit us over the head with that metaphor, Joe. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thanks, Bridie.
And thank you, Lenore.
Thanks, Bridie.